quite amused that culture is dealt in the first session of today. That's not political issues, it's not economical issues, but it's culture. And I'm not saying that in a cynical way. I'm actually quite delighted. But that brings us immediately to a very fundamental question, which is, what can cultural exchanges do in order to foster and strengthen relationships? Or if I use the wording of today's colloquium subtitle, what can cultural exchanges do in order to strengthen foundations for tomorrow's challenges? If I become even more critical, might I be able to question, do they really matter? Do cultural exchanges really matter for the relationship, and do they work? I think the general assumption is that yes, they're very important, they work. Nobody says that we should not have cultural exchanges. But then why is funding towards cultural exchanges diminishing everywhere, from the state, from the private sector? Why is it not being given the financial support that it should be given? And actually, this is the question that is being asked everywhere. I don't know if some of you are aware of a conference called the Ditchley Foundation. Ditchley Foundation is an Anglo-American foundation which was established because a lot of the Americans and the British thought that if the Americans and the British had been talking, engaging more closely with each other before the war in order to tackle the problems that led to the war, maybe the war could have been avoided. Now, whether you think this is arrogant or not, that's another matter. But the most important thing about Ditchley Foundation is that since the end of the war, it has been dealing primarily with political issues, economic issues, and international relation issues. But 2 years ago, for the first time, Ditchley Foundation held a conference about culture. And the title of that conference was very direct: Cultural Diplomacy, Does It Work? I was honored to be part of that conference, and I must say that the conclusion was very messy, and there were very few recommendations that came out. And that also reflects the nature of this debate, because it is not a straightforward debate. If I introduce to you some of the conclusions that came out from the conference was, it is difficult to find a new rationale for cultural diplomacy and exchange to be promoted. Secondly, it is difficult to convince government, companies, politicians that more funding has to go to cultural exchanges, especially in a world where we live today, where we have to fight terrorism, where we have to fight epidemics, where we have to maintain the level of social welfare that we have. Why do we have to put in more money to cultural exchanges? It is very difficult. And especially if it's not only about promoting your own country. If it's more than that, why should states or why should companies, for that sake, put money into it? And thirdly, the big question is, what is the real impact? Can you measure the impact of cultural exchanges? It's very difficult. It's even more difficult than any other field, I imagine. And again, what is the impact at all? Those were the questions, conclusions, if you will, that came out. And from there, I'd like to move in a bit to the Japan, Portugal, European cooperation. So who are the actors of this cultural exchange? Of course, we have the state, the government. And although probably the role of the state may be not as overpowering as before, without the government, without the state, you can really not have cultural exchanges. It's not only about money, it's because of the specific venue, environment that states can provide. Also, if government decides that we're not going to let artists or intellectuals of a certain country to come into my country, then exchange won't happen. So it is fundamental that the state is involved. And then you have the major cultural institutions. In the case of Japan, it's the Japan Foundation. Now, there is yet to establish a Japan Foundation office in Portugal, but we do have a Japan Foundation office in London, which is in charge of Europe as a whole. But then when you think about it, what is the cultural exchange between Japan and Europe? Is there a specific message that Japan wants to emit to Europe? And even more difficultly, is there a European message, European cultural message that you want to project to Japan? It is much easier, I believe, in the bilateral context. But as Europe as a whole, is there really a message, a cultural message that you want to project? The third actor is the academia. And here, I believe that the academia has been successful to a certain extent in creating cultural exchange ties. If you look at Japan and Europe, in Japan you have what is called the European Union Studies Associate, established in 1980. This is a group of very distinguished scholars who dedicate their research on European matters. And then when you look at the European side, you have what is called the European Association for Japanese Studies. This is a group of scholars of Europe, Japan, and even from the United States who gather every 3 years, and they network. The main objective of their gathering is network. This year in Slovenia, they had their once in a 3-year conference, and you may know or you may not know that the next conference in 3 years will be held in Lisbon. Lisbon was elected as a country to host this important conference in 3 years. So yes, the academia has been successful. And then fourthly, you have the people. And probably the role of people in cultural exchanges is getting more and more important. Why? Because we live in a time of the social media. And in particular, for the younger generation, everything is about Twitter, everything is about Facebook, everything is about LinkedIn. The reverse of that is that the message that comes from states is becoming, unfortunately, more and more boring. Young people are not interested that much in what governments or states have to say about culture. And they are more interested in engaging with each other, which is, I believe, a very healthy thing, because after all, cultural exchange is not about only projecting a message, but being in an interactive relationship. I'd also like to talk a bit about the non-charitable, non-profitable sector, which is the sector where I am. And if you may allow me to do a bit of propaganda, or promotion, if I will, about my own institute, because we are rather, how should I say, unique. We are a British organization, although our name is the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. We are British because our funding comes from a British supermarket chain, and we are registered as a British charity. And we operate from the UK. The second thing is that we put research in the core, but we put equal emphasis on outreach, because we believe that research that does not reach the general public is not valuable enough. So we do a lot of lectures, exhibitions, we have a special connection with the British Museum, and we also publish a lot. Thirdly, we believe that Japan is not one thing. We think that Japanese culture and Japanese art, it's something that we have to use in the plural sense. So our title is the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, because we think that there is not only one culture in Japan, there is not only one form of art in Japan, but there are many. And sometimes they may go against each other, but that in totality is Japan. Fourthly, we believe that, as in any country, the past defines the present, but in Japan, perhaps that continuity is stronger than other countries. That is why the three main areas of our research and outreach is archaeology, visual culture, and thirdly, contemporary Japanese media. So we try to connect these three areas as in a linear way. And fifth and lastly, what we are trying to do now, after 15 years of activity, is not only to promote Japan in Europe, but to bring back the message to Japan. We want to bring the message back to Japan on how Japanese culture is received, transformed, and seen in Europe. So just last Saturday in Tokyo, we hosted a big lecture about Japanese archaeology and how it was formed through a relationship between British and Japanese archaeologists in the Meiji era. And this is how we try to make our activity interactive, as I mentioned. The third part of my message is actually what should be the message of cultural exchange. And I'd like to just throw in some ideas for later debate. In culture, I think more is better and different is important. I think that, because Ambassador Zanetti talked about difference, but it's not only difference between Portugal and Japan. I think it's about difference within Portugal and difference within Japan. And how to embrace this difference, this diversity, is very important. And for that matter, I believe that organizations like the Japan Foundation, or British Council, or the European cultural bodies, they should always have an arm's length relationship with the government. Because again, it is not about what one message should be projected, but it's about how different messages should be brought together. I also think that the pursuit for interactive exchange, as I mentioned, is highly important. And this is about projecting your image, and then after that, your message might be criticized. Your message might be asked to be changed, and then you have to listen to it. That is, I think, the modern way of cultural exchange. It is not about a one-way projection of your idea. And that's quite tough, especially when government is funding something. If what you're trying to promote as a policy or a cultural idea is criticized, is Japan, is Portugal, is the European countries, are we mature enough to engage in this cultural exchange? That is something that is to be seen. And then I'd also like to say that it's not worth only talking about grand ideas, like maybe I've been doing. We have to, at the end of the day, go in to look at small things and make concrete things happen. For example, this is a very small example, but it's very important. I know that there is a very important Namban art collection here in Lisbon at the Museum of Antiquary Art. But I also know that the conservation level is not good enough because there's a lack of expertise, and this happens all over the world. There are vast numbers of Japanese objects in many museums, but because of the lack of the knowledge about conservation, they get lost, they go into decay. So what can Japan do for this? These are the things that, at the end, we need to work on. And they may seem small things, but that is what keeps our cultural relationship live. My last point before ending my talk is then what are our challenges? I think there are two big challenges: how to create interest in each other, and then how to help promote projects that will respond to these interests. I believe that between Japan, Portugal, Europe, there is enough interest in each other's culture, and that is very fortunate. Especially in the younger generation, people are fascinated, I hear, with what Japan does. Sometimes I don't understand why they are so fascinated about some things, but maybe that's because I've become too old. But it's very good that there's interest. What is the bigger challenge is the funding. And EU has a big war chest of money for this kind of funding. Each 5-10 years they come up with a big funding program. The next one is called Horizon 2020, and I understand that there is a budget about £100 billion to promote projects. And from my experience, I know that they don't fund only European projects, they fund projects that relate to Asia, that relate to Japan. So here we have a big opportunity to strengthen our cultural ties, but for that we need to do more networking. Is the funding from Japan enough? This is my last question. I think we have a tendency to put more emphasis on a relationship with the United States and the Asian countries. And somehow, although everybody thinks that Europe is important, not enough money comes to here. So that is something that I think that we should be changing. And finally, how about the companies? The companies are very important because they can really make a difference. In the British Museum, which is, I believe, one of the best museums in the world and important, two companies, Mitsubishi Corporation and Asahi Shimbun, they fund the Japanese gallery and they fund the Asahi Shimbun gallery. And these are the places where people from all over the world who come to London, who come to the British Museum, see what Japanese culture is about. And if it is not for these two companies, these things won't happen. So I believe that companies are very important in the cultural exchange as well. I'd like to end my talk with a question. So going back to the rationale, what is the rationale for building cultural exchange? And I'll be honest, I don't have the good answer. And I want to think that it shouldn't be only, the onus should not be only put on the people who promote it, but to the governments, to the companies, to the people, to think about what is the rationale. And if collectively we think that there is a rationale for promoting cultural exchanges, it will happen. Thank you very much.